When the war ended in Europe in May 1945, Britain did not celebrate in the skies. The great aerial armadas that had filled the air during the Battle of Britain were gone, and the fighter that had come to symbolize the nation's survival, the Supermarine Spitfire, sat silent on grass airfields across the country. Rows of them stretched from the cliffs of Kent to the Scottish Highlands, their once polished skins dulled by weather and neglect, their engines cold. For 5 years, the Spitfire had been Britain's shield, its sound the difference between invasion and survival. Yet in the moment of victory, it found itself without a future. And the story of what happened next is one of necessity, loss, irony, and unexpected rebirth. During the Second World War, Britain produced more than 20,000 Spitfires in dozens of variants, each slightly different from the last. The aircraft evolved continuously under the pressure of combat, climbing faster, flying higher, and carrying heavier armament with each new mark. But war also accelerates technology, and by 1945, aviation had crossed a threshold that no piston engine fighter, no matter how elegant, could ignore. Jet aircraft were no longer experimental curiosities. They were the future. Britain's first jet fighter, the Gloucester Meteor, had already entered service before the war ended, and within months, it was obvious that the Spitfire, magnificent as it was, belonged to a vanishing era. Britain itself was exhausted. The country was financially ruined, its cities bombed, its empire beginning to fracture. There was no money to maintain a massive wartime air force, and no reason to keep thousands of fighters that no longer fit modern doctrine. The Spitfire had not been defeated in combat, but it had been overtaken by time. As demobilization began, squadrons were disbanded, pilots returned to civilian life, and aircraft that had once been guarded like national treasures became surplus property almost overnight. The fate of most Spitfires was brutally simple. They were scrapped. Entire airfields were cleared with astonishing speed. Aircraft were flown to disposal units, their wings removed, engines pulled out, and aluminum skins cut apart for reuse. To a nation desperate for raw materials, the Spitfire was no longer a symbol. It was a resource. Perfectly flyable machines were reduced to piles of metal within days. Some aircraft had logged only a handful of hours since leaving the factory. Others had never fired their guns in anger. None of that mattered. Britain needed housing, infrastructure, and industry far more than it needed memories. At the time, almost no one protested. Wartime Britain had learned to look forward, not back. The idea that these aircraft might one day be historically priceless barely existed. Aviation museums were rare, preservation was expensive, and sentiment was a luxury. Veterans who had flown the Spitfire understood this better than anyone. They had loved the aircraft, but they had also seen friends die in them. For many, watching the Spitfires disappear was not heartbreaking. It was a sign that the war was truly over. Yet not all Spitfires were destroyed. Britain had allies to support and former colonies preparing for independence, and surplus aircraft became tools of diplomacy. Hundreds of Spitfires were sold or transferred to foreign air forces around the world. Some went to Europe, others to the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. In these places, the Spitfire gained a second life, often flying combat missions long after it had vanished from British skies. One of the great ironies of post-war history is that Spitfires fought new wars that Britain itself barely acknowledged. In the late 1940s, they flew over Palestine, India, Pakistan, and Southeast Asia. They were used by both sides in regional conflicts, sometimes facing former allies, sometimes facing other Spitfires, The aircraft that had once symbolized unity against a common enemy now served nations with their own ambitions and divisions. In the Middle East, this irony reached its peak. During the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, Spitfires, flown by different air forces, met in combat. British-built fighters, designed to counter German aircraft, now chased and shot at each other over desert skies. In one extraordinary incident, Israeli Spitfires shot down British RAF reconnaissance aircraft, unaware that the planes they were firing at were flown by their former suppliers. It was a moment that captured the strange afterlife of wartime technology, where weapons outlive the politics that created them. Back in Britain, the Spitfires that remained were given lesser roles. Some became advanced trainers, used to teach pilots before they transitioned to jets. Others were converted into target tugs, towing long fabric sleeves behind them so anti-aircraft gunners could practice their aim. The symbolism was stark. An aircraft that had once fought desperately for survival now flew predictable paths while being fired upon intentionally. It was not humiliation, but practicality. The Spitfire was still useful, just no longer glorious. Many others simply vanished into obscurity. Britain had too many aircraft and too little space, and disposal methods were sometimes shockingly casual. Some Spitfires were dumped into the sea, pushed off barges, or abandoned near coastal airfields to clear space. Others were left to decay where they stood, stripped of valuable parts and forgotten. For decades afterward, divers would occasionally discover Spitfire wrecks on the seabed, their shapes still recognizable beneath layers of corrosion and marine life. These underwater relics became silent memorials to an age that had ended abruptly. By the early 1950s, the Spitfire had almost disappeared from active service anywhere in the world. Jet fighters dominated the skies, and piston-engine aircraft were relegated to training, secondary roles, or retirement. Of the tens of thousands built, only a tiny fraction survived intact. The rest existed only in photographs, memories, and the stories of those who had flown them. Then, slowly, attitudes began to change. As the immediate trauma of the war faded, a new generation looked back with curiosity rather than urgency. Historians began to write about the Battle of Britain not as a current event, but as history. Veterans grew older, and their stories took on a sense of fragility. The realization dawned that something irreplaceable had been lost, and that what remained needed protection. The surviving Spitfires, scattered across museums, airfields, and private collections, became objects of reverence. Restoring one to flying condition was no longer seen as extravagance, but as preservation. Yet restoration was anything but simple. The Spitfire had been designed for wartime production, not longevity. Every part required precision, authenticity, and expertise. Engines like the Rolls-Royce Merlin had to be rebuilt almost from scratch, often using techniques that had nearly vanished. Some of the most dramatic chapters in the Spitfire's post-war story involved recovery rather than restoration. Rumors circulated of aircraft buried overseas, left behind by the RAF at the end of the war. In places like Burma, stories emerged of Spitfires sealed in crates and buried to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Expeditions were launched, decades later, driven by the hope of finding untouched airframes frozen in time. Results were mixed. Some searches ended in disappointment, but others recovered damaged aircraft that could be restored. Each recovery felt like an archaeological discovery, a physical connection to a moment when the world had hung in the balance. As restored Spitfires returned to the air, their impact was profound. When one flies today, it does not simply perform, it evokes. The sound of the Merlin engine, the elliptical wings cutting through the sky, the distinctive silhouette against the clouds, All of it triggers something deep and collective. People who never lived through the war seal it. Those who did often fall silent. No modern jet, no matter how powerful, produces the same response because no modern aircraft carries the same story. Today, fewer than 100 Spitfires exist in airworthy condition, and each is considered priceless, not because of what it can do, but because of what it represents. The Spitfire embodies a moment when survival depended on courage, ingenuity, and sacrifice. Its post-war fate, scrapped, sold, forgotten, and finally rediscovered, mirrors Britain's own journey from wartime desperation to peacetime reflection. What happened to Britain's Spitfires after World War II is not just a story about aircraft. It is a story about how societies move on from crisis, how practical needs can erase symbols, and how time can transform tools of war into treasures of memory. The Spitfire did not fade because it failed. It faded because it had done its job. And in doing so, it earned a legacy that no scrapyard, no ocean, and no passing of years could truly destroy.